This presentation is intended to provide an explanation of the North Carolina Conservation Partnership, how it continues to evolve over time, how the partnership is interconnected, and the roles and responsibilities of each partner. Its intended purposes include use at SWCD board meetings, training new supervisors and staff, and education of the general public. This presentation is divided into 4 modules, each being 15 to 20 minutes in length to provide flexibility in its use as an educational tool. Each slide contains background narration. It is intended that the modules be viewed in sequential order to grasp the most complete understanding of the extensive partnership. Individual modules can provide a useful refresher after the entire presentation has been viewed. Once the PowerPoint presentation for each module is started, the slides will change automatically. Nothing in this presentation is proprietary, therefore it may be shared with others as deemed appropriate. This presentation is provided by the North Carolina Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts. Module number 1, entitled How It All Started, covers the very beginning of the soil and water conservation movement and the significance North Carolina played in that movement. The time frame from the late 1920s until 1937 includes the creation of the Soil Conservation Service, creation of conservation districts, and the establishment of the State Committee, which provided direction and oversight to the newly formed conservation districts. North Carolina has one of the strongest conservation partnerships and programs of any state in the nation. That strength comes from the number of agencies and organizations that make up the partnership, their interconnectivity, and the relationships that exist one with the other. Therein lies one of the reasons that many consider the North Carolina Partnership to be very complex and difficult to understand. In order to help with that understanding, we will dismantle the partnership and build it back piece by piece, starting with the very beginning and continuing chronologically to the present. This will demonstrate how the partnership has evolved over time and continues to evolve even today. Pay special attention to the timeline at the bottom of most slides and to the upper right corner, which will explain the type of relationship between and among partnership agencies and organizations. As you see, some relationships are very formal, being established by general statute or agreement, while others are more informal, yet just as important. External partners such as the Farm Bureau, the Grange, Land Trust, the North Carolina Department of Ag and Consumer Services, and many others, as depicted in the upper left, add great strength and diversity to the overall partnership as they work individually and collectively within the partnership. Their relationship with the internal partnership is quite different, yet still very important. This relationship is represented by the bubbles that intertwine themselves throughout the partnership. Local soil and water conservation districts are the hub of the conservation partnership, and throughout this presentation will always be shown in the center of the frame. The focal point of the conservation program in North Carolina is the local soil and water conservation district, and the partnership has been built around these districts. It is always important to remember that the conservation program is implemented at the local level through North Carolina's 96 local soil and water conservation districts. The modern soil and water conservation movement began with an individual by the name of Dr. Hugh Hammond Bennett, a scientist who was educated at the University of North Carolina. North Carolina can take great pride in the fact that Dr. Bennett is a native son, being born and raised in Anson County, only a few miles outside Wadesboro. Beginning in the 1920s and continuing into the 1930s, Dr. Bennett became alarmed at what he observed across the national landscape: the depletion of the soil resource because of erosion. Equally concerning was the lack of a concerted effort to do something about it. Dr. Bennett was an interesting individual, and he's described as someone that had an evangelical zeal. Whenever and wherever he could attract a crowd or even a small group, he would preach about the need for conservation to protect the soil resource base. He was also a bit of a showman, which added great power to his presentations and his effectiveness, which we will see later in the presentation. Dr. Bennett is known nationally and internationally as the father of soil conservation, a fact that makes North Carolina proud and a fact that should never be forgotten. The basis for Dr. Bennett's concern was the dust bowls of the West and Midwest and the severe water erosion in the South. He was seeing the soil resource being depleted before his very eyes, to the point the landowners would wear out one field, abandon it, and move to another area, eventually wearing it out as well. A great challenge for Dr. Bennett was the fact most individuals considered the depletion of the soil resource to be caused by acts of nature, great windstorms and heavy rain, events that man had no control over. Dr. Bennett, for many years, was an army of one trying to convince everyone, including Congress, that the problem was man's treatment and management of the land. He continued to work tirelessly to bring a national focus on soil erosion, and finally, through a publication that he wrote entitled Soil Erosion, a National Menace, he was able to take one step forward. As a result, in 1933, he was able to convince Congress to appropriate $160,000 to fund soil erosion investigations. This was a major step as it created the national attention that he'd been looking for and provided an opportunity to prove what he'd been preaching for years, that soil erosion could be controlled or at least greatly reduced by the actions of man. Continuing in the early 1930s, the soil erosion investigations provided evidence of Bennett's claim and led to the development of demonstration projects which were supported by the federal government and implemented on public lands. The timing of the soil erosion investigations and the need for demonstration projects was perfect. The United States was coming out of the depths of the Great Depression, and there was a great need to put unemployed Americans back to work. President Roosevelt saw this as an opportunity to create the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was to provide the labor to install the demonstration projects on public land. CCC camps, as they were commonly known, were scattered across the nation, and many were located in North Carolina. The formation of the CCC program led to the establishment of the first federal agency to address soil erosion, the Soil Erosion Service, which was established as a temporary agency in 1933. A pivotal point in the history of the soil conservation movement occurred in 1935, with an increased focus at the federal level. Congress passed Public Law 46, which created the Soil Conservation Service and established for the first time a national soil conservation policy. It is important to note that this policy set the stage for an important shift in the soil conservation program, that being a shift to emphasize soil conservation on private lands. Dr. Bennett knew that if this nation was going to make significant strides in addressing the soil erosion problem, that attention must be given to private land. As might be expected, Dr. Bennett became the first chief of this permanent federal agency. As a side note, we earlier mentioned the showmanship qualities of Dr. Bennett, and he used those qualities very effectively in convincing Congress to pass Public Law 46. History indicates that Dr. Bennett was scheduled to make an important presentation to a committee of Congress regarding the need for national soil conservation policy. He very masterfully timed his presentation to coincide with the arrival of a great dust storm that was headed eastward toward Washington, D.C. As the sky darkened and a great haze filled the air, and just before the brunt of the storm hit Washington, it's reported that Dr. Bennett flew open the windows of Congress, pounded his fist on the windowsill, and proclaimed, "Gentlemen, get ready because here comes Oklahoma." Public Law 46 was passed in that same session of Congress. Showmanship at its best. So it is now 1935, and we've built the first piece of the Conservation Partnership with the creation of the Soil Conservation Service. As indicated here, SCS, as it was known, was a single standalone agency with the daunting task of reversing the degradation of the soil resource base and shifting the national focus from public land to private land. The federal government trying to have an impact on private lands, you say? Dr. Bennett quickly saw this as problematic and an obstacle to delivering an effective soil conservation program. There were just too many examples of how the federal government's attempt to make influential decisions regarding private land had gone astray. Being the visionary that he was, Dr. Bennett knew that there must be a local focus to the soil conservation program if the program was going to be successful and effective. Even though technical assistance was coming from a federal agency, which was important and necessary, having a delivery system to private land and landowners would necessitate local input. Dr. Bennett's solution to this challenge was the creation of local soil and water conservation districts. He saw conservation districts as the bridge between a federal technical agency and the local landowner. Bennett began working with President Roosevelt to encourage this concept and developed example state enabling legislation that was shared with governors across the United States. Legislation that would provide the opportunity to establish local soil and water conservation districts. North Carolina created and passed General Statute 139 in 1937, and the foundation was laid for the creation of local soil and water conservation districts. Dr. Bennett is credited with saying, "I consider the soil conservation districts movement one of the most important developments in the whole history of agriculture." Soon after the passage of General Statute 139 in North Carolina, the first conservation district in the nation was established, and very fittingly, that first district was the Brown Creek Soil and Water Conservation District, which included Anson County, North Carolina, the home of Dr. Bennett. It is important to note that at this time in history, the relationship between the Soil Conservation Service and local districts was somewhat informal as compared to today. It was more a cooperative relationship that resulted from the creation of a federal technical agency at the national level and local districts which were created at the state level. At this point in time, it is also important to note that the district was simply a board of supervisors who were providing local guidance and input into a soil conservation program which began at the federal level. The only employees available to provide direct assistance to local landowners were employees of the Soil Conservation Service. It is now 1937, and we continue to rebuild the Conservation Partnership with the addition of the second piece to the conservation puzzle, the Soil and Water Conservation District. From this point forward, the district will remain as the center of the Conservation Partnership as we rebuild it in its entirety. Although there were basic agreements, the relationship between SCS and the local conservation district was more informal as it wasn't established by state statute but more simply represented as a relationship between a federal agency and a locally led district board. Another important step in building the Conservation Partnership in North Carolina also occurred in 1937 and also through General Statute 139. Through legislative action, the North Carolina legislature created something known as the State Committee. This committee was charged by state statute to provide supervision, oversight, and guidance to the newly created soil and water conservation districts. At the time of creation, the State Committee was comprised of 3 members. Interestingly, the 3 members of the State Committee, which was created through General Statute 139, were the Director of the Agricultural Extension Service, the Director of the Agricultural Experiment Stations, and the State Forester. There was no staff assigned to the State Committee, so it was the responsibility of these 3 individuals to provide the necessary oversight and guidance to the local conservation districts that would form across the state. Now we've added the third piece to the Conservation Partnership puzzle with the establishment of the State Committee. It is now important to note that there are 3 parts to the Conservation Partnership. 2 of those parts are interrelated or connected very formally through general statute as shown by the red line. But this did not change the relationship between SCS and the local conservation districts, which remained more informal. This, though, begins to add some complexity to understanding the partnership as SCS now has a connection to the State Committee, but only through the districts. With the creation of the Soil Conservation Service, local soil and water conservation districts, and the State Committee, the foundation has been laid on which to build a strong soil and water conservation program in North Carolina. We will see this as we continue to rebuild the Conservation Partnership in the next module. Module 1 of 4 has now been completed. Module number 2 will cover the formative years from 1937 to 1971. These years include creation of the North Carolina Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts, the National Association of Conservation Districts, the evolution of the State Committee, and the addition of the first staff to support conservation districts.